I'm thinking of, all right, the moral of the story. I have this thing working around, but the moral of the story of what I'm going to talk about is how much I've talked about it, but it's got to be talked about more. Is how much the Egyptian aspect. Two things. I'm going to mention two things, and then the rest of this time, which is, I guess, 36 minutes and 28 seconds, which means I'll probably try to stop it somewhere in the 35-minute mark, is one, the underestimation, the gross underestimation in the quote unquote Christian world of 2 billion ish people, and not necessarily by any fault of their own, um, but this lack of appreciation and, like, even preeminence of the Egyptian aspect of the Bible, not as just these little points. The quote unquote Mesopotamian aspect, the Arabian aspect of this white bread version of Christianity that circles about, how it lacks an appreciation for the deep roots Egyptianally. That's one. The other thing that I hope I can tie it in 36 minutes, I don't know, is the whole 20th anniversary of 9/11. I'm not getting too caught up in it because when I was younger I was obsessed for a few years with 9/11, and so I know there isn't a conspiracy theory about it I haven't come across yet. There's the conspiracy theories. Many of them differ. Some of them so much that they stand alone. One I won't mention, the one I will mention, one I won't mention stands alone, but I'll mention it elsewhere. It has to do with Hieronymus Bosch. The one I will mention has to do with Jesse Ventura. I'm not going to say what it is, but he talked about it. But there are many levels of information, of stories, of wars, of rumors of wars. And even the fake shit matters. How we take it. The story matters, and the flesh and blood matters, and the dust and ash matters. And no matter how smart we are, without a God's eye view, we'll never put it together completely correctly. Yet, within our incorrectness, within our take of the story, yes, there is a truth there. Anyway, that wasn't what I was going to say. So far as the Bible goes, even the New Testament, like the underappreciation of the Egyptian fact of the matter is grossly underestimated. Never mind India, Krishna, Zoroaster, but Zoroaster's kind of a link. because we always focus on the Mediterranean and not that other side of the Arabian Peninsula and Ethiopia. Because so often, for instance, the what we've agreed is Mount Sinai, what we've agreed is Mount Sinai, is as close to the Mediterranean as it is to Malaysia. And there's a lot more islands in that area. I mean, seafaring in the greater Malaysian area at the time of, well, the long history of the Bible, there's a lot more going on there. Naturally. Just makes sense. But there isn't necessarily a Rome or a Greece or an Egypt there to interpret it or give an account. From a unique or a histories are fictions, but the greater the power, like the greater the fiction, and the more it stands over time, true or not, yet the truth's there. Kind of like when people, because in the Bible, at least in the King James, like Shishak, 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 because that's associated with not Samuel, Solomon. And then, what's his name? The Egyptian pharaoh, Shoshank, otherwise known as Shawshank. Anyway, I still haven't gotten to it. Egypt. And because it's the 20th anniversary, I'm not getting too worked up about it, but I've watched a couple things that I wouldn't have watched if it weren't the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I watched again. I watched it relatively recently when Jon Stewart was at Congress fighting for first responders, like, basically medical and just funding for the people who were dying from quote unquote 9/11 disease. I do also remember how Tom Cruise, back in the day, there used to be some videos that were kind of popular that have faded away a bit, of how Tom Cruise set up these detox centers for first responders. And so people shit on him for his Scientology shit, but he used his Scientology shit to save people's lives. So, if I remember correctly, it has a lot to do with vitamin B and sweating. So despite all the brainwash shit, there's some also real shit there. Just like in the rest of us. Even in the story that we carry with us, there's some truth there. Anyway, the whole thing with Jon Stewart, he kills it, man. He hits it out of the park. And I can't help think and okay, so I'm gonna kind of turn. So you should watch Jon Stewart 9/11. A couple years back, he testifies at Congress, or I don't know exactly how it came about to be, but and what I'm about to say, if even though I'm using that video, or that testimony as a symbol, and I feel very strongly about it. Like if Jon Stewart himself was like, "You got it all wrong, you stupid motherfucker. Why'd you even mention me?" If he said that to me, I wouldn't hold it against him at all. I'd be like, "You're right." So I'm not saying it like this is what he was doing, but like my interpretation, or one of my interpretations of like the Last Supper, would be Jon Stewart. Like that's like the Jesus figure at the Last Supper of the Passover. And he's got the mob of Christians behind him. And he's like yelling at the disciples who are kind of Pharisees. We always associate the disciples more with Jesus than with the Pharisees. We always associate the disciples, the disciples and Jesus, dividing line, Pharisees. But another way of thinking about that is no, these are those who, without Jesus, would have been Pharisees. Some of them. Some of them nothing. He's participating in the Passover to kill the Passover, which is related back to Egypt. But that wasn't the main point of my video. What I really wanted to talk about was just a couple very simple things that are super important. And that's, yeah, really two things. Mary. First thing, Mary. And how that's related to Egypt. Because, well, there are three, I guess, or I think, I don't have it all right. I don't know it all. I get shit wrong. Sometimes when I get it wrong, though, I get it right. Because when we get it right historically, or the way it's been told, when we get it right always the way it's been told, sometimes we get it wrong because the people telling it fucking wrong. So sometimes when we get it wrong intuitively by the way it's been told, we're getting it right because something inside of us is trying to fix what was wrong that came before us. But even what was wrong that came before us isn't necessarily evil or bad. It was right for its day. But every day a new day comes. Progress cannot be stopped. Can't be. Cannot be. But yeah, Mary, an Egyptian, Mary Hotep, Mary Totten, Merit, Mary, happy. In Egyptian, the word that keeps coming up is beloved, that Mary means beloved. Mary Totten, Mary Totten, beloved of the Otten. Beloved. Looking up in Strong Concordance of Mary, the only word that I found on BabaHub, under a quick search, it was mostly like, yeah, Mary, this person, that person, this person, that person, this person, that person, rebelliousness came up. I'll have more to look at it later. Rebelliousness. So if you're both, and this is the other thing before I get into why those are connected, besides the fact that at the very least, according to the Bible, like 400 and something years in Egypt, that's older than the United States. So how many people have come here from how many other countries over how many years? And how long does it take to assimilate before your grandchildren or great grandchildren are no longer assimilated? If all of your ancestors came here 400, not that all of them would have then or now, but if your ancestors came here 400 years ago, do you have anything to do with where they came from? No. The slaves that were released from Egypt were Egyptian. They were the lowest tier, but they were Egyptian. Period. But it weren't quite like that, because it was very messy. There's a lot of smears. It's an expressionist, you know. That whole region is one big fucking Jackson Pollock painting. Well, maybe not Jackson Pollock. Maybe not Jackson Pollock on one side, not Rothko on the other. Maybe Larry Rivers. But yeah, when Jesus was born, he was wrapped in swaddling cloth, and I had to look this up, you know. And apparently, swaddling cloth it's strips of linen, you know, and you bind the baby. You bind the baby so that the baby's a package. It can't move its arms, it can't hurt itself, or whatever. You bind up the baby, carry it along. Now, and especially in times when like you didn't know a lot of psychology or whatever, like that's super useful. You got this flailing thing, you have work to do, there's a lot of walking, there's no cars, there's no baby seats, right? If you're lucky, you got a donkey, you might got a cart. If you're in the army, you might have a chariot, right? But for the vast majority of people, it's just brutality, you know? So you have the swaddling cloth, which are these strips of linen. Apparently, I read it somewhere else, you know, apparently, because we think of the whole nativity scene, it's like Jesus in the manger in this barn, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe it wasn't a barn, maybe it was the bottom level of a stone house, because a lot of times, supposedly back then, people would have a 2-story house, they lived on the top, their barn was in the bottom for their livestock. But when you live in like a house built of stone or brick, it's almost like a cave. But then also, okay, so he was born in a cave, in a barn, with farmers, but it wasn't really a barn. It was a Levitical, it was a cave where the sheep slept. In a farm run by Levitical priests. The Levitical priests were the ones who would do the sacrifices, so they're raising these lambs to be killed in place of themselves. Because that's the whole point of Abraham, is that Abraham emerged from a culture that would kill its own. And instead of killing his own, he killed a lamb. It's bloodthirsty, it's awful, it's terrible. But killing a lamb is better than killing your own son. That's progress. That's a good thing. That's better. Especially if you're going to eat the lamb anyway. Because people who kill their own kids, yeah, they're going to eat the fucking lamb. So if you don't kill your kids and you eat the lamb, that's better. That's butterfly effect shit. That's God making a choice at the railroad. And that's you making that choice at that railroad to serve God. Less butchery. Less butchery. Motto, eating after respiration. But anyway, that swaddling cloth would also be be used for strips of linen were like the wicks of oil lamps, olive oil lamps. So it's really simple. Mary, beloved of Egypt. Mary meant beloved. In Hebrew, or in, actually, it's hard to say what Mary's name, I guess it must have been Aramaic if Jesus spoke Aramaic. Like I said, I'll have more to look into, but in the Strong Concordance, the first thing that came up is rebellious. So if you're both beloved by God and rebellious, what are you rebelling against? False gods. But the super interesting thing about swaddling cloth because yeah, in this thing I read, it was saying how basically the Levitical priests, as soon as they saw Jesus, were like, "Holy shit, this is the Messiah," because he's the light of the world. He has the lamp wicks wrapped around him. You know, the swaddling cloth ain't the fucking big old blankie. It's a bunch of little strips, and there's some old school, you know, some old like Orthodox icons I've seen with that image, with basically, you know, Mary and Jesus and like this twirl around Jesus and so on. But it's also the perfect symbolic representation of kind of like the resurrection of an Egyptian king, because Pharaoh, God, because they were wrapped in the cloth. So like Jesus in swaddling cloth, a Pharaoh dies and is wrapped in that swaddling cloth to be reborn in what, nature. I can't remember the name, but it has something to do with nature, which is also what they called more or less like Ethiopia, Nubia in Egypt. But and that he was born from Mary, and that Mary is beloved and rebellious. All those Marys, Mary Magdalene, Mary, Mother Mary, which is Saint Anne, or Queen Anne. The reason why the Jews that were pulled toward Christianity, because the first Christians really were, you know, historically Jewish people. Or at least in that milieu, in the greater context. the reason why he hooked is, even if the story's mythologized, not quite true, because it's mythologized perfectly, it counts. Sometimes, the story overrides the fact of the matter. Sometimes the story matters more than the fact. But because the story holds and has effects over time physically, it becomes real. And because it becomes real, because it has an effect, it was real to begin with. Also, the three wise men from the East. Depends what we mean by East. That can mean anything from Turkey to Japan. North and South. But anyway, whichever East you choose, those folk came because of signs, so on. There's the Gospel of the Magi, which was recently discovered in the Vatican vaults, untranslated, just left to dust, and one dude was like, hey, can I do that? And they're like, yeah, sure. Translated into English, and it's just like, clap, clap, clap. My impression of crickets. But why did they come? Because he was also the symbolic answer for them. Everything came up to that point, and everything came out from that point. I shouldn't say everything, but the largest constituencies of the past collapsed upon that point, and the largest constituencies of the now have exploded from that point. In slow motion to us. Explosions in eternity. But I'm not faulting anybody for being like, fuck that shit, fuck that, I ain't faulting you for it, man. Yeah, fuck that. Because you gotta go deep. Have I gone deeper than the average bear? Certainly I haven't talked about things deeper than the average bear, but one time I went deep enough where I can't imagine there's anything below it. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm not being as passionate about it or as convincing about it as I should be, but the fact that Mary is Mary, and what Mary meant in Egypt, and the fact that we interpret the Bible being so Arabian, essentially, and Mediterranean. And we give very, very little look. As a 2 billion people thing, we give very, very little look to the profound, it's almost the primary influence of the entire culture is related to, it's Joseph and Moses, definitely as far as Moses is concerned, 18th dynasty. My bet's on Akhenaten, thereabouts, Nefertiti. And then, yeah, Joseph, Jacob, all that. I feel pretty strong it's Imhotep. doesn't line up with the timeline, but we might be missing some books and some genealogies. Plus, people were named the same name. Things get mixed up. I think there's one part in the Old Testament. Well, one interesting thing, yeah, is like there's a Jonathan, and then he dies, and then there's like another Jonathan right after. That almost never happens so far as I'm into the Bible. I'm up to like 2 Samuel. That almost never happens, where there's like 2 people with the same name, like more or less one right after the other. And another thing, shit, I can't remember what the other thing was I was going to say. The other thing in that time period, because I was saying they might be missing a few books. Yeah, just the way they use names. And refer to things and change names. It's a very tricky book. Oh yeah, what I was going to say is like there's one point, I can't remember if it was Solomon or Samuel, but like when Moses takes the census, there's like 600,000 fighting men, right? So that means there's probably more than twice that. So 1,500 or 1.5 million to 2 million people back in Moses' time who were, quote unquote, Jewish. And later on, I can't remember if it's Solomon, but it's right around that time period, takes a kind of census, and there's like 600,000 Israelites. $500,000 Judeans, and I think that was right before like Israel and Judah split, because back in Moses' time there was like 60-ish thousand Judeans out of 2 million. But then when they're taking the census, there's yeah, maybe about 600. I'm probably getting the number wrong, but thereabouts. Even say a million, right? Say there were a million Judeans more or less around the time of Solomon, and 500,000 are Judeans before the split. So I feel like that's actually a typo. It should be 50,000, I think. That might be a scribe typo that just carried through time, because it doesn't make sense. It might make a little sense a few years later, after the split, and it might depend on just allegiances and loyalties, but it's hard to believe that. Maybe it's not hard to believe because of the prophecy of God loved Judah best. They like to hump more, and it's a funny thing that the world is dominated by successful humpers. But I should be reminded that that's one way of looking at it. But in a world where rape is not the norm, even in this world, amongst us, love prevails.